afternoon, and welcome to today's Building Power episode with me, your host, Zakia Sankara Jabbar. And I'm very excited today to be joined by Dr. Ivory Toldson, brother Dr. Ivory Toldson. He is the president and CEO of the QEM Network, professor of counseling psychology at Howard University, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education, and executive editor of the Journal for Policy Analysis and Research, published by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Previously, Dr. Toldson was appointed by President Barack Obama to devise national strategies to sustain and expand federal support to HBCUs. As the executive director of the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities. With more than 80 publications, Dr. Toldson was dubbed the leader who could conceivably navigate the path to the White House by the Washington Post, and one of 30 leaders in the fight for Black men by Newsweek Magazine, and the problem solver by diverse issues in education in higher education. A sought-after speaker, Dr. Toldson has been featured on MSNBC, C-SPAN, NPR, and numerous other national and local radio stations. Dr. Toldson, according to former U.S. Secretary Arne Duncan and our board member, is a prolific young scholar and myth buster. Welcome, Dr. Toldson. I am ecstatic to have you here with us today. Really excited to get into this conversation with you. And I just think, it would be great if we just started off with something, really basic. Tell us, what inspires you about this work and anything else you want our audience to know about you.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And, we've known each other for a while. And I've always appreciated your activism and your perspective on issues that affect the Black community. How did I get started? I think I was born started. I was raised in a household, fortunately, with parents who understood the value of educating Black children and the tradition of Black scholarship and Black activism. The first book that I learned how to read was a book called I Look at Me by Mari, what's her last name? She was a Third World Press author, but that was the first book I learned how to read where in the 70s, and there was a little Black kid with a afro going through his community, talking to Black people at the grocery store, Black police officers, Black firefighters, Black social activists, Black businessmen, and Black people that was, just having a good time in the neighborhood. And so those experiences shaped me who I am today. My mother also was owner of a daycare center that was based in the community, and she was very passionate about giving Black children positive Black images at a very early age. So that's where I got started, all the way back then. And I'll pause there and we can fill in the gaps for it.
Absolutely. Where are you from, by the way, if you don't mind me asking?
Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I thought so. I knew you had some Louisiana roots, and I remember talking to you maybe over a year ago, and I made that connection because I also grew up in the Southeast. I grew up in Beloit, Alabama. So I can kind of hear it still a little bit in your accent, even though I know you've been in DC for a while.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, I got attracted to your work a while ago. As you know, I'm an activist. I got into this work pushing back on criminalization and also the pathologization of Black children, particularly when my son was 3 years old and being already identified by his white teachers in preschool as a problem. And I became politicized. Lots of folks who probably know this show probably like, girl, you talk about that all the time. But anyway, the book that politicized me was by Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu, as you know, Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. And that book really just opened my eyes because, he wrote the first edition of that book in the early 80s. And here I was in 2011. And it was like he wrote the book yesterday, like during the time that I was, because what he actually described in the book was exactly what I went through.
Mm.
And he actually gave practical tools for how parents and families could push back and advocate. So, thank God, for his work. And it certainly has influenced a lot of the way that I organize. But one
Mm.
of the things that I love about your work and how I got attracted to you, because, as as Black folks and sometimes as organizers, we can be socialized into the negative all the time. We'll hear
Mm.
negative statistics about us, particularly in education, which is why I'm so excited that you're here to kind of do some of this myth busting that Arnie Duncan talked about, especially when it comes to Black boys.
Mhm.
And, can you just share more about why you're passionate about disrupting these harmful myths and stereotypes about Black children in education? Feel free,
Yeah.
to dive into connecting the history, because I really want
Mhm.
us to go deep here if we can, because I want people to understand there's a lineage, right? There's a reason
Right.
why even liberal scholars do this, kind of deficit thinking when it comes to
Mhm.
Black folks and Black children.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always say that when someone who is a staunch Black activist is screaming the exact same thing as the most racist white person is saying,
That's right.
then it's probably something wrong with what
Your
you're
work
saying.
checked me. I'm telling you. Yeah.
Um, and so it's I think I became concerned about this narrative after I released a series of reports for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation called Breaking Barriers. Now, I'll say that I used to say the same statistics. I didn't have any reason to believe, for instance, that there wasn't more Black men in prison in college, because I trusted the the community of scholars that always seemed pretty objective. They never really seemed like they had an agenda, and they might put out something, and other people might have an agenda, but I never really doubted the scholarship. If it was widely noted that there are more Black men in prison than college, I didn't believe that there was any counter argument to that. The only
Right.
counter argument came in the why.
Wow.
So I
Mhm.
was there, um, but I think that pretty early in my career, I realized that we weren't getting any solutions
Right.
from those types of statistics. That it was more so to alert people and alarm people,
Yeah.
but the follow up seemed really flat.
Right.
So I started to doubt the utility of those stats before I started actually doubting the actual stats.
Right.
And so when I started my own work, with the Breaking Barriers reports, I decided that I wasn't going to focus on the things that was wrong with Black children. I was going to try to find the Black children who were beating the odds
Right.
and use that to find solutions for those Black children who are having some issues or some problems. And with that strategy, I really didn't have much of a use for the shock statistics, and and I was also reading essays of young Black boys and started to talk to some young Black boys, and I could tell that they weren't getting anything from those statistics. Like if you talk to a group of Black high school boys and tell them all the odds are stacked against them and that more of them go to jail than college and 50% of them dropping out, I could tell that that wasn't doing anything for them. And in fact, it looked like it could have some harmful effects. But when you started telling them the path forward and started telling them about people who was in situations just like them, but they did this great thing, that's what started to spark and ignite them. Um, so that's when I started to shift the way that I would talk and position my work. But what I ran bumped up against very early in that process are people who did not even trust the research that I was doing because they had bought into this negative narrative. Now, a lot of the stuff that I was finding through analyzing all these databases probably sounded too simple in order for people to think that it would work, right? So, for instance, there was a data set that I analyzed called Health Behaviors in School-Aged Children, and I found that Black boys who reported having more healthy diets were doing better in school. Now, does that mean you need that changing the diet will automatically help them do better? No, it's a whole bunch of things. And I think I presented a whole bunch of things in the report, but it was a lot of little simple things like that that kind of built up into this big picture. But for the people that were thinking that, we need to completely dismantle the entire public school system, or that, we need to, you know, ban teachers unions, or we need to ban this movement, like these types of things, me saying that there were some simple tweaks and fixes just didn't satisfy them. And their counter argument always came back to what I consider the BS, the bad stats. So, this whole thing of
Let's get into that. That book really, and I'm not done. I'm a give a disclaimer here. I'm not completely done with it. I got so many books that's on my shelf right now that I'm not always able to get to. I love Dr. Amos Wilson too, and his magnum opus, and he's one of my favorite authors, is Blueprint for Black Power. That book is 800 pages, and I'm just halfway through it. But there is some very powerful connections that you do make. And we're going to drop a link in the comments for people. Your book that you released, I believe, in 2019, No BS, Bad Stats. And the quote that's on the front of that book really just resonated with me, brother. You say, Black people need Black people, or need people to believe in Black people enough not to believe everything bad that they hear about. And like that to me, like, checked me really deeply, because we know that we're socialized by the media in this country. We're socialized by, different images of how Black boys and Black men and even Black women, and to some extent, how we look, to the world and through news and through all of these different things. And I was like, that's so real. Like, we cannot believe everything bad. And like, I'm just grateful that we have people like you, right? You have the intellectual capacity and the actual credentials to be able to challenge these people who write about us in sociology. And we know, there's racism. I argue, and you may disagree because you are in higher education, but I argue that racism is refined in higher education. Racism is so much more sophisticated in these so-called, academic, some of these academic journals and things, who constantly, come out with this negative, kind of research to describe Black folks. But I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the BS, bad stats.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's, I think you illustrated and characterized it well. We are conditioned to believe the worst about Black students. So much so that when you challenge people on certain preconceived notions, especially statistics, they almost think that you're not, like all types of things. Like you're not smart, or you're against the cause. It's really weird. And I have to give a shout out to Jenks Morton before I go too deep into this, because at the time when I was struggling with all of that, he was the one that challenged me to really delve into the legitimacy of a lot of these claims. But I did find it odd that people who were so passionate about Black issues would think that I was selling out because I was saying there were more Black men in college than prison. Like, like if somebody says something good about anything else you cared about, You know, like if person after person was telling you that your son was functioning, uh, you know, in a below average intelligence, you know, so person after person was telling you your son was a slow learner, and then you had this one psychologist that said, you know what, I've tested your son, and I have good news. Your son is actually above average intellectual functioning. The others just didn't do the right test. You would be
And
celebrating.
yeah, absolutely. But here, this is a good interjection though, because remember, I've organized mostly working class parents in my base community in Dayton, Ohio, before I transitioned here to the DC region. And I'm gonna be honest with you, Brother Toldson, like that was my reaction, just intuitively. But unfortunately, some of the parents, and I think Dr. Tommy Curry actually points to some of this data, some of the parents, because of the socialization, sometimes they believe when educators and some other person tells them that something is wrong with their child, they believe it and they run with it. And I've seen some cognitive dissonance with parents when I have encouraged them, because a part of my organizing strategy, because of what happened to me, I would always encourage parents, please get a second opinion. A lot of these psychologists and you know, not to shit on the whole profession, but a lot of them have been trained in this deficit model to see Black people, right? And I want you to talk about that, because I know you teach psychology, or you teach in some of those areas as well. But please talk about that.
Well, you know, collectively, you know, just like you talked about those parents, you know, collectively, you know, Black adults, we are the parents of Black children. And we have been conditioned that exact same way. We've been conditioned to only believe the worst in our children. And so that's why if I ask a group of whoever, they could be educators, they could be professionals, it could be whoever, parents, lay people, people in the community. If I say, are there more Black boys currently in honors classes or special education, everybody will say special education. Like, it's just really hard for them to wrap their minds around there being more Black men in honors classes, Black boys in honors classes than special education. Now, I mean, there's some legitimate reasons why they have that doubt, because we are overrepresented in special education. We are underrepresented in honors classes, more so than any other race gender group. But when you start to just ignore the Black boys who are in honors classes and allow your definition of what a Black boy is, your conceptualization, to be those that are in special education, then you end up not being in a position to make sure that the vast majority of Black boys, because understand this, you know, even though there are more Black boys in honors classes and special education, we're the majority, the vast majority of the Black boys in neither one of those categories.
Exactly.
Right? They're not in honors classes, they're not in special education, and they can go either way. But if your conceptualization of them are being more likely to go to special education, then you have a very difficult time steering them towards honors classes. And that's the
That's so
quandary that
real.
we're in.
That, I mean, so I've lived that too, right? As you know, Kunjufu talks about in his book, you know, the kind of language or adjectives teachers will use about our children and say, you know, oh, you know, he refuses transition, or this is what I heard about my son, or he's being difficult, or things like that. And he would say, well, why don't you say, well, is he exhibiting leadership skills, right? Like using different adjectives for the children, and even like getting the teachers to see something different other than always being a problem. But recently, and you know, it took us, my son's in 8th grade now, took him to 6th grade to get a master teacher who happened to be a Black woman. We're in MCPS out in Montgomery County. And she saw his brilliance almost immediately, right? Where all the other teachers only saw the behavior as a result of him being bored to death out of his mind, you know, in the classroom for not being challenged. But this particular master teacher pushed him and had him tested, and he ended up being in her honors class in English. But
Mhm.
it took all of those years for teachers to see, you know, his actual brilliance, to see that he can actually perform at a high level if there is high expectations.
Mhm.
So I think that piece also is critically important. And so another part is I really encourage parents to push back against negative narratives about their children
Mhm.
from educators.
Right. Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. Um, and you know, a lot of Black parents don't feel empowered to, talk about a lot of these things because you have so many people that hide behind their degrees and their credentials. And, like, if your child gets tested and the test says that your child is a certain way, a lot of times we feel like we can't challenge that. But, we can. I mean, at the end of the day, you know your child better than anybody else. So there is no degree, and I'm saying this as somebody with a PhD in psychology. There's no amount of training that's going to enable anyone to know your child better than you,
Ooh,
because
that's good.
yeah, because you are with your child every single day. Every single day, this person is with your child for about 3 hours if they do a good assessment, but most likely less than that. And a lot of what they put in their report are things that you report to them, the interview that you give them. So we really need to know ourselves better than anybody else. And we talk a lot about the individual, but I think there's some parallels to the collective. And so Black people collectively need to challenge this stuff. And the only way we're inspired to challenge it is if we believe in ourselves and not believe every bad thing about ourselves.
Absolutely. We're, as you know, the chat is very active so
Mhm.
far, and I think these are people that you know. So, brother Jeff Kennedy, who, as you know, is based
Mhm.
in DC. He has a question. He says, "Please discuss, I guess, the connection of eugenics in New York
Mhm.
City and DC public schools, and how that's connected to this conversation."
Yeah. Well, we know that testing has its origins in eugenics, um, from the studies that was done at Stanford, um, with the research where they tried to track all of these students who tested very high at a very early age. And at a certain point in this nation, there was a lot of belief in being able to track a certain group on through to their life and their career, and you know measuring them early and then position them for success later. But what a lot of people don't realize is that most of the large studies that tried to do that failed, and that most of the students that they tested turned out no better than students that did not test as well. And in fact, there were students who was excluded at a very early age because they didn't test well, who went on to win Nobel Peace Prizes and things like that. Um, but the influence of testing on different decisions that are made all the time work to the disadvantage of Black students. Um, and
Say more about that. Are you saying that testing in itself works to disadvantage Black children?
yeah, making decisions based on standardized tests, yes, and that's probably pretty much universal. Um, everything from placement tests to tests for college achievement. Um, it works to the disadvantage of Black students. There are various theories as to why that is, but
Can you share a few of
when
those?
well, one theory is that the test measures a particular way you are socialized, more than it measures your actual cognitive abilities. Also, there are cultural biases embedded within the test. So just the way that they explain certain things, one concrete example is in the intelligence test. This is the Wechsler scales, which is one of the most common intelligence tests out there. In the latest version of it that I saw, and there's been versions since then, I'm not sure if they took this out, but there's a question that asks, if a child much smaller than you tries to start a fight with you, what is the best thing to do? In order to get the highest rating on that test, you have to say do nothing or walk away. If you say tell their parent, you get a lower rating. Now, I don't have to explain the cultural bias that's embedded in that. And there's an argument to be made that, you've done that child a disservice by doing nothing. That means you don't care about that child. If that child much smaller than you is a child that you care about, then absolutely you tell their parent. But
and this is an intelligence test? That's ridiculous.
That's an intelligence test. So you can see how culturally latent, something like that is.
We was told to knock somebody out. They mess with us.
Yeah, and that's a response that get you no
right.
you get no points for that. And and I'm certainly not going to say that hitting children who are smaller than you is a part of the Black culture.
I know, no, not like that.
But no, it's telling their parents will actually get you a lower rating on that particular item than doing nothing. So that's an example of it. But tests have become a very convenient way to excuse different social inequities and classification systems. And we see how the expansion of tests, at a certain point, it started to hit the suburbs, because the suburbs were pretty insulated from it for a long time. And it wasn't until Common Core that you start to see it creep up in the suburbs. I think it was a little bit of market saturation that was happening in urban areas. And so the suburbs became this new market. And those parents were like, oh, hell no.
They went off. They formed whole groups in Ohio. They scrapped the park test in Ohio.
Yeah. And I think
white people went off.
Right. And I remember Arnie Duncan speaking to that. How, when the tests were showing that suburban white kids weren't as smart as we thought they were, that's when they began to get a lot of criticism. And I think Arnie Duncan received a lot of criticism from that statement. But he was right in that regard. I don't think he said it to diminish the importance of tests, though. I think he said it to amplify how bias is getting in the way of our best action. But I also think that there's some huge biases there. And, the fact that they rejected the test when it showed that their children weren't doing well shows you the larger social strategy that's been embedded in the test since their inception.
Yeah, that's good. Dr. Kalila Harris, one of your Obama colleagues, is also in the comments with a question for you, Dr. Toldson. She says, how does Dr. Toldson challenge school districts to move beyond culturally responsive pedagogy to identifying this deficit thinking and addressing
it? Well, one of the things that we have to understand is that schools were built on a platform of institutional racism. And there are certain things that we place a lot of emphasis on that's important, but they're ineffective because we haven't really dealt with institutional racism effectively. So these are things like teacher diversity. You can have a school with majority Black teachers and still have poor outcomes because of this platform of institutional racism. So the fixing the problem has to start with the foundation of the problem. And the whole way that education is set up, where teachers have standards that they have to adhere to, and they have to report to somebody else, and that somebody else that they report to reports to somebody else, and it keeps going on and on. And by the time you get to the top of this hierarchy, you have someone making decisions that's so far removed from the reality of the situation and so close to the origins of the problems, which is institutional racism. So you're always going to have these problems. Um, Culturally responsive pedagogy is a strategy, but it's impractical within the framework that we have in existence. So the only way that we're going to advance culturally responsive pedagogy is to reformat the system to where there's a couple of things that needs to happen. One, there needs to be a shifting away from the standardization of education to the humanizing of education. And what I mean by that is, as long as teachers are trained, credentialed, and evaluated based on these standardized things that they have to do, and not for adhering to the greater good of the child, then we're going to have these problems. What teachers need to be taught are higher principles of good and decent behavior towards others, racial equity and justice. That should be the standard. And how you achieve that can vary somewhat based on your own abilities and the children that you work with. And so it's not a process of standardization, it's a process of teachers working for the greater good of their students. But right now we don't have that model. And so you can have a teacher, you can train a teacher in culturally responsive pedagogy, and if they do the things that would be in the best interest of their students, they would be seen as insubordinate because something else would have to be sacrificed, another standard would have to be sacrificed. So my answer is that we have to look at the larger structure of the school system that's very much rooted in institutional racism. And that needs to be broken down first before we start to advance those smaller things like diversity, culturally responsive pedagogy, and some of these other very important things that needs to happen.
That's very interesting. So the next question is, right, because this is certainly not a new idea. Folks know that education is, like you said, an institution that perpetuates institutional racism. How does one go about breaking down a system like that, right? And I think that we are starting to hear some conversations about that even now. As you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Lots of schools are online and virtual. There's a lot of concern, at least on the part of some parents and students, about access, even to get about access, right, to even broadband, to even do virtual learning. Is this a time,
Right.
particularly for Black people, that we can be really reimagined? Because there are parents, I'll tell you, Dr. Toldson, who don't want to go back to the same schools that their kids
Yeah.
were in. They want something different. And how can we use this moment to really be pushing for what our communities and families really need?
Yeah. Well, there's so I have an award from the National Science Foundation to study this very issue.
Oh,
And
wow. Tell us about that. Congratulations, by the way.
yeah. And so what the alternative model that we're exploring is based on something called, and this is a term that I coined, but it's humanistic distributed agency. Now, distributed agency is something that is known through computing. The humanistic aspect of it is something that I introduced to it. But right now, I explained that hierarchical approach to education as it exists right now. The hierarchical approach is a dated model that removes decisions from the people who are actually doing the work and placing it to someone with such a great distance from it that that the strategies become pretty disconnected and not consistent with what we need for society right now. Now, distributed agency, it simply means that the the right to make certain changes or to um, vary what you do in the classroom is distributed across the people actually doing the work, as opposed to centralized at the top of this apex-like structure. So it gives teachers of conscience more power to do the things that are in the best interest of their students. Now, this doesn't mean that you take education as it exists right now and just give all the teachers this power. Because, like as the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. So what has to happen is there needs to be a reshifting of priorities that's enabled through technology. Technology enables teachers to reduce the amount of cognitive effort in teaching. By that, I mean, you don't have to memorize as many facts. You don't have to do as much research. You don't have to be this human computer that's learning all of this stuff and just reciting it back to your students. We don't have to do that because we have computers that are enabling all of these cognitive tasks. With that happening, with that shift happening, then you can amplify the humanistic qualities that should be the new standard or the new norm of teaching. And so it becomes the humanistic qualities become the primary thing that that determines who is a good teacher rather than their cognitive abilities. Right now, cognitive abilities is still number one, and humanistic qualities are, I wouldn't even say they're number two. They're somewhere out there. The humanistic qualities needs to be elevated to number one because cognitive capacities is shifted towards our use of computers. We're all using computers now. It's not even an option anymore. So with that, you can start to train teachers on the greater good of what they do rather than these discrete tasks. You also put teachers in a system where they can do more, they have more authority to make different changes, like what they teach, how they teach it, the type of relationship they want to have with their students inside and outside the class, all these different things. But data science enables us to be able to track what they do in a much more efficient manner. So teachers can start to log these things that they do more effectively, and that goes into what they are rated and evaluated on, and it also helps us to evaluate the entire system. So we can see that if Zakia has implemented this type of curriculum in her class, and she is logging that, we can track Zakia's student success, as opposed to Zakia, students is taking the same test that every other child is taking, and we're rating Zakia based on how well they do on this test. So we eliminate that. We can look at how
So it would eliminate testing, and it would what other, so then, because there's going to be people like, well, if we don't test, how do we know what to do? So it would eliminate tests and be replaced with this humanistic platform that you're designing through the grant for the National Science Academy.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways in which we can determine how well a student is doing, right? So we can look at the grades that they are receiving across their different classes. We can give student satisfaction surveys to see, how happy they are. We can track their participation in extracurricular activities, their leadership, whether or not they have won any awards or received any recognitions. We can look at their attendance, um, um, how often they come to school, how often they come on time. We can look at various behavior indicators. So there's a wide range of things that we can track and measure. And before technology became as sophisticated as it is right now, it might have been unrealistic to track all of these things for every student. I would argue that that's not unrealistic today, that we can put a system in place to better track this information. So we could look at the totality of a student and see how they're doing across all of these indicators. I would argue that all of those things that I just listed, their satisfaction, their grades across all of their classes, their participation in extracurricular activities, all of these things, where they go after they leave that particular school. So if it's in the middle school, how many students go to more selective schools and things like that. I would say the totality of all of those things tells us more than how they perform on a standardized test, especially when we consider the fact that the same expanded cognition and the same computer-enabled cognitive capacities that teachers are getting, the students are getting the same thing in life. So the same way that teachers don't need to demonstrate that they have memorized everything in order to be an effective teacher, I don't think students need to demonstrate that they've memorized a whole bunch of stuff to demonstrate that they can be a good professional later on in life. So we do have to rethink and reimagine, what does success look like in this, highly technical era. And more broadly, we also need to think about what does the post-reform era of education look like. If we think about education reform as a movement or as an era of education, it probably started around the late 80s when we realized that desegregation efforts weren't yielding the types of results.
It took us that long to realize it, right?
Yeah, it was about the 80s. Because desegregation was strong, throughout the 60s and the 70s, when the idea was that if we integrated schools, then everyone would have access to the same things, and that would lead to equality in education. We realized probably around the 80s that because of the resistance to integration efforts, and because within schools that had been integrated, we still saw these inequities. That led to the reform movement. And the reform movement was based on standardized testing. It was based on eliminating the achievement gap. It was based on um, other things like um, having given students access to things like magnet programs, and some things not so bad, if you think about them. Other things really bad. But I think at this point, if we haven't learned, just like we learned in the 80s that desegregation in and of itself was not going to achieve the things that we need to understand that right now. And
Can we pause and acknowledge that there were Black people who cautioned against the whole integration movement, especially in the schools, even though they didn't win that argument during the civil rights movement? There were Black folks, Black nationalists, who was like, and particularly, I believe, in some cities like Baltimore. There's a brother that's a teacher. Akil Parker is my son's math tutor, and his father, I'm losing his name right now, is an educator and taught in Baltimore City schools. But he did his thesis, his PhD thesis, on the fact that there were Black people in Baltimore who themselves refused to integrate because they didn't want to put their kids through what we saw on TV and Ruby Bridges and all of that. They started their own schools and was like, well, okay, no, we're not doing this. And in those cases, because I think this idea, it's really romanticized. You still have people, who will go nameless right now, but there are people on Twitter who are still pushing this idea of integrating our kids into these schools where the teachers, we haven't even talked about teacher demographic, but teachers are majority white women at that. I know in my experience, every time there was an issue with my son, it was a white woman teacher. And so I just think that there's so much, that people aren't thinking about.
Yeah. And diversity of thought is important, and it's certainly important for us to recognize those that caution against desegregation efforts. But I don't think we need to go as far as to say that one was right and one was wrong, because it was a larger system. Ernie Green, who's a mentor of mine, he was one of the Little Rock Nine, and it was a black teacher at his school who was inspired by Carter G. Woodson, who encouraged him to integrate, to be a part of the group that integrated that school, because, she saw that, and he saw it at the time as a revolutionary act. That you're not going to tell us, where we can go. So, I think that, regardless of the methods, I think we can all agree that to make it illegal to go to a certain school because of the color of your skin is wrong. What we should not have done is romanticize it and think that in and of itself was going to help any. Integration has made a comeback. There are some scholars that are starting to think about integration again, and a lot of them come from cities like New York, because what the southern schools are actually a lot more integrated than northern schools right now.
It's so true.
And so a lot of the integration movement is coming out of the northern states, who never really experienced federally mandated desegregation efforts, and they have dealt with a far more sophisticated white population. I hope I don't get in trouble by saying that.
No, we keep it all the way 100 on this show.
not to diminish the sophistication of our southern white people, but they do have a lot more money. White people have a lot more money and resources in cities like New York. The economic gap between black and white is far greater in a city like New York than a city like Birmingham, Alabama. And so white people in New York have used their resources to be able to segregate schools without looking like racists.
Man, we don't even have to go to New York for that. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland. And if you've been paying attention to what's been happening in Montgomery County and Howard County the last year, they just wanted to do a boundary analysis in MCPS. And white people in Potomac and, and all of these areas went ballistic.
Yeah.
And Howard County, it was really bad. Some of the comments, public comments that you heard, and even here in Montgomery County from white, and not just white folks, it's Asians as well. We keep it 100 on this show. So, NAACP, LDF, in fact, got involved with our local NAACP to push back on the lawsuit that Asian parents in Montgomery County filed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, this issue is very sensitive, and I will say from my perspective as a parent, and I live in Montgomery County, and I'm totally fine with my son attending the school that he attends. It is predominantly Black and brown, but I don't want the psychic violence that he would receive going to a Whitman, because we've seen the swastikas I mean, these kids, they're coming from home where they're learning this racism. They're learning to think that Black people are inferior. So I don't want my son to go to a school like that, where it's majority white and that's how they feel about Black people or Asian people, whoever.
Right.
I'm okay because my husband and I supplement his education anyway. He's being taught who he is at home.
Right.
So I guess I'm not for, I can't be for the whole integration movement. I get like the ideas behind it, like and people wanting their children to have access to more resources. I just choose personally as a parent to supplement my children's education and not put them in harm's way where they will receive, to me, much more harmful mental and psychological violence.
Yeah, yeah. And I agree with that. I think that we're a lot of us are still looking at old systems when we should be looking at, revolutionary new systems. What I'm proposing, isn't anything related to, bean counting how many, Black or white students are at the school or even the teachers. I want us to think differently about what it takes to be a good teacher. And if the system as it is right now, if we think about the preparation of teachers, the recruitment of teachers, the credentialing of teachers, and the evaluation of teachers, which is pretty much standardized. We're not going to get any type of radical change out of that system. We have to create a model where humanistic values, racial sensitivity is how we train, recruit, credential, and evaluate teachers. Just as simple as that. A system where a teacher
How do you measure
racist.
that though? I think that's what I'm struggling with. How do you measure humanistic values? Especially if we're still coming from communities where we're segregated, right? We're still coming from communities where we're socialized to think about others as the other. Like, is the teacher program going to undo all of that?
Right. So it's hard to measure that, just like it's hard to measure intelligence. That didn't stop us from trying. But one of the problems is beyond the measuring of it, it's the prioritization of it. Now, if you look at the mission statement of most schools, most of their mission statements has the language that you would want to hear. The problem is that the mission statement is not central to what they do. So you can have a mission statement that says, we take any student, regardless of their race, our gender, our sexual orientation, or any other characteristic, and we propel them to their greatest heights, lifelong learners, experiential learning, like all of that's in these mission statements. But when teachers get in their staff meetings, are they hearing that? No, they're hearing deadlines, when they're going to take the PARCC test, what percent of students need to do this, that, and the other, a standardized curriculum, like when the teacher ratings are going to be. So
I'm listening to you, brother, and you know who I'm thinking about? I'm thinking about the first Black woman to be the superintendent of DC Public Schools, our Queen Elder Mother, Barbara Sizemore. And she talked about this whole testing thing. And I think you probably know that she was on the other side of that, because I will say that I am in agreement with you that testing is not the best option. I don't know if I would take it completely out of the toolkit, so to speak, on how to measure in a spectrum. Like, it could be a part of many things that we use. I just don't know if I would completely take it out. And the reason why, and she pointed this out, it's a little video still up on YouTube. People can go watch it. She was like, well, if you want to go and be a doctor, you got to take the test to even get in. you got to take the LSAT to get in to go and be a lawyer. So if we're going to
Mhm.
get rid of testing at K through 12, is there a similar movement to get rid of these tests when we get to college?
They need to. I mean, and there are studies that show that those tests don't really, they don't measure what we need to measure anyway. And the same changes that's happening in society, I mean, lawyers and doctors do not have to memorize all the things that they used to have to memorize. You
Yeah,
have lawyers and doctors with tablets right there next to them, and you have doctors that are talking to patients that have read WebMD. And if the doctors aren't,
hilarious.
if the doctors aren't really up on everything, then they could have a patient that almost has the appearance of knowing more than them. And a lot
That's
of
real.
and you have some doctors that hate that, and some doctors that
They do.
welcome it, and some
Right.
doctors that welcome it. Some doctors want more informed patients, but other doctors are afraid of patients having access to all of that information. So yes, this is being fought on all levels. Um, the what we really need is mission driven education. So we
Yeah.
need the greater mission to drive what teachers do, as opposed to a standard. So
Yeah.
if a teacher knows that their students have to pass this test, they're going to concentrate all their efforts on that, and they're going to be very frustrated with any student that's not doing well on that. But we all know the limitations. I mean, we could very easily make the argument that a student needs to have an oral examination before they leave high school, that they need to be able to talk in front of people and be able to express
I
themselves, or
love that idea,
to
actually.
debate a point. But
Yeah.
we don't do it.
I
So
love that. Yeah.
yeah, so you can have a student, and that might be their gift. Now,
Yeah.
if that's your gift, there's some good things you can do with that.
That's real. Yeah.
But
You could be a broadcast journalist.
right, but there's no mechanism by which that's going to factor in any kind of way how well you do in school.
Yeah. This has been a really great conversation. We have only a few minutes left, and I want to just give you for number one, I definitely want to bring you back on because you brought up technology, and we didn't have enough time to really delve into it now, especially as you continue to matriculate in your research and the studies that you're doing with the NSF grant that you got. Again, congratulations! Really proud of you for that. I'm looking forward to what comes out of that. But I want to bring you back on to talk a little bit about technology and how technology, we're seeing it being accelerated right now, because of the pandemic, how it really has the potential to revolutionize education. It
Mhm.
came up the other day. We had a virtual town hall, and thanks for the recommendation. Dr. Carol Lee did agree. She came on our virtual town hall we had on Monday, and we talked about a little of that, about how some districts could potentially be digitized, especially poor districts that we're seeing lay off a lot of teachers, and AI and all of this stuff. So anyway, I'm going to have a larger conversation about that with some data scientists, Black data
Mhm.
scientists and technologists, and talk about like what they're seeing, because we're not talking about this, Dr. Toldson. Like even in the education realm, like us as activists, I'm like, we are so like behind the times with how technology is like creeping in and
Mhm.
like just changing stuff up. And then like, how are we going to ensure equity and all of that? But anyway, I want to give you an opportunity, just share some closing comments. Where can people find you, right? We dropped the link to your book in the chat. Is there anything else, just closing comments you want to share with our audience before we wrap today?
Yeah, no, it's been a hearty conversation, and I know that we're right at the last minute. So just thank you all for allowing me the space, and to continue to think bigger and broader than what we have going on right now. There's no system that's in place right now uh, in education that's absolutely essential in its current form.
Yeah.
So we can't think that anything is indispensable, whether it's a test or, credentialing efforts, our the leadership as we know it. So we need to think bigger.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm with that, thinking bigger and broader. Well, thanks so much, you all. Sorry for that. We had some technical difficulties earlier, but thank you all for joining back with us on our Facebook live stream. Definitely the comments and questions were good as always. Thank you all for joining us. Next week, we'll be joined by Maisie Chen, who is the co-founder and executive director of Cadre out in LA. It is a base building organization that organizes in South Los Angeles Black and Brown parents. We'll be talking about Black and Brown solidarity, how they got started, and the amazing and impactful work that they are doing in South Los Angeles. So next week, make sure you join us here, same place, same time, Citizen Ed, noon on Wednesdays. And our guest is Cadre and Maisie Chen from South Los Angeles. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the show today with Dr. Toldson. We'll see you next week.